Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And those of you watching the recording, thank you for taking the time to join us for another one of our incredible LGBTQ plus Pride Heritage Month events. We have a virtual artist talk that you are joining us for today. I'll let Judy do the formal introduction for that, but I did just want to welcome everyone and also acknowledge the Associated Students of Foothill College for the sponsorship and the planning for this event, along with the photography and fine arts department. We work together very closely each month for the Heritage Month series. And definitely please log on to the Heritage Month pages to see upcoming events that we have all year long, from October to June. I think December is the only month that we don't have a Heritage Month, so we have a lot of really great events and activities on campus. I think that's about it. I will pass it over to Miss Judy Walgren to officially get us started with the event and introduce our incredible guest speaker today. So over to you, Judy.
Thank you, Victoria. And I just want to give you a huge shout out because you and your group have been a huge supporter since I arrived last September of sponsoring these artist talks for the various affinity groups who we highlight each month here at Foothill. In and of itself, an amazing project. Sorry, I just had to admit somebody, an amazing feat that you all are able to provide to students and open up to us so that we can bring people from all different backgrounds into our community so that our students can see themselves working in the areas that we so love. So thank you so much, Victoria, and your whole organization for the support.
My
Now
pleasure.
enjoy your grass.
My pleasure.
So I'm super excited to introduce my colleague and amazing friend and source of intense inspiration, Dr. Tara Pixley, Ph.D. And she's very much more than a queer Jamaican visual journalist and assistant professor of journalism at Temple University, but we can start there because her list of titles and accolades are longer than we have time for in this hour-long talk. In the talk, she's going to discuss an ethics of care approach to photojournalism, which she introduced me to while we have been writing a book about the decolonization of the practice of photojournalism together. And through this work, she will highlight what an ethics of care looks like in photojournalism and visual storytelling through her two very powerful projects that I've had the privilege of seeing. The first would be Immersed in Oil, where she's been documenting environmental justice issues around oil production in Southern California. I don't know if some of you have been driving around at times to and from Pasadena. You can see the wells that are there just in the middle of neighborhoods. It's pretty mind-blowing. And, it's one of those things where I've driven by it and said, God, I need to get out and go photograph it. But Tara did it. So that's hats off to her for that. And then she also has another fascinating project of many, which documents a Tijuana shelter run by and for LGBTQ plus Central American migrants and asylees. Her list of awards and acknowledgements go on, but she was a 2022 Reynolds Journalism Fellow. She's been a Pulitzer Center Grantee. She was an International Women's Media Fund NextGen Fellow in 2020, an awardee of the World Press Photo Solutions and Visual Journalism Initiative, visiting Knight Fellow at Harvard University's Nieman Foundation for Journalism. And she is also a prolific writer, and she writes about photography, around ethics in photography and visual storytelling. She works with the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, Newsweek, Nieman Reports, and a Black Scholar, among many others. Actually, you could probably find her work in any major media publication. She's also made videos and documentaries, and she is definitely a scholar. So, and an advocate, each using visual media to frame race, gender, climate futures, LGBTQ plus, and immigrant communities through a liberation lens. She's also the vice president of the National Press Photographers Association. She's on the board of a stock photo co-op called Stocksy. And last but certainly not least, she is the founder, co-founder, and the director of Authority Collective, which is an organization dedicated to establishing equity in visual media. And as I said, we are working on a book together about decolonizing our practice of photojournalism. And with that, Tara, need to take a break for a minute and have a drink of water, but take it away. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Judy, and thank you to everyone at Foothill for bringing me here. Can everyone hear me okay? Does sound good? Okay, wonderful. Thank you. And hopefully you can see, I'm sharing my screen. Can you see that? Delightful. Okay. It's always awkward to sit through your own biographical information. Thank you, Judy. I want to give a little bit more information on who I am as a visual journalist and as an artist, kind of the behind the scenes of, the bio, which is always the best parts of our public facing selves. So I have been working in visual journalism for 20 years, and that's been a very interesting process across that time. I started in photography, working for my college newspaper, and moved on to a staff photojournalism job at the Greenville News in South Carolina right after I finished my undergrad. And from there, I had the opportunity to do a lot of incredible internships across the Southeast. Or prior to that, rather, I was able to do many internships. And then after leaving the Greenville News, I went on to work as a photo editor for CNN Digital. We're kind of housed in the, not the cool part of CNN and the Atlanta headquarters, but the kind of basement where they put all of their website workers. Maybe they've moved them up in the last decade. That would be great. But I learned a lot about the power of photo editing and the importance of selecting really impactful imagery when I was working with CNN and also with Creative Loafing, which was a alt weekly, an alternative weekly, news weekly in Atlanta that is now not entirely defunct, but not quite what it was in its heyday, where it was a bastion of alternative thinking and independent media in the Southeast. In all of those experiences, I bring them up because they informed my relationship to storytelling, to visual storytelling, and thinking about what kinds of impact do we have as visual storytellers? What opportunities do we have as photographers and writers and journalists, and data reporters, data visualizers, filmmakers? There's so many different areas of storytelling and nonfiction storytelling where we have the power to impact people's lives, both our audiences and the people that we're working with, the people whose lives we are documenting. And I was starting to feel as I kind of move through these different visual journalism roles, I was beginning to feel that there was something lacking for me, that there was not just problems of representation in the images and news media we were putting out, but issues within the newsroom where we were not recognizing how some of our practices were falling short. But I didn't quite have the language at that time to put it into words. And I also didn't have the time, right? When you're working as a deadline-driven journalist, it's very difficult to sit down and think, kind of, something feels off here. What is it? And so I decided to get my Ph.D. And I went to UC San Diego and completed a Ph.D. in communication, where I focused on photojournalism. And I studied specifically issues of inequity and lack of diverse perspectives in the photojournalism industry. And from that, I was able to build a career as an educator and to continue as a freelance visual storyteller, where I continue to take images or make images rather, and work in a lot of different spaces in visual journalism, including as a freelance photo editor for the New York Times, working on writing books with wonderful people like Judy, and also working on scholarly articles with Martin Smith-Rodden, who's another wonderful colleague of mine here today. And some of the things that I think about now as a scholar and an educator and also as a practitioner, I think about journalist safety. And what does it mean to be working as a journalist today in where we are so maligned and unsafe in many places due to the kind of rise in distrust and fear of journalists. And what is the connection between our safety and our ability to do our job and our connection to trauma-informed reporting practices? What is our connection to, or what are the connecting kind of tissues of making ourselves safer as we also build trust within the communities within which we're working? I'm thinking a lot also about AI in journalism now, AI and photojournalism specifically. What does it mean to use this technology? How do we, help the communities that we're working with? How do we help our audiences, folks whose stories we're aiming to tell? How do we help them understand what we do as visual journalists so that they can tell the difference between AI generated images and images produced by humans who care and who are there to tell true stories to the best of our ability? And I'm also very invested in thinking about and documenting and elevating stories of environmental justice, and often through a solutions journalism lens. So thinking about what are people doing already to address these issues in their homes and their communities and things that are impacting their families. And how do we elevate the stories of people who are already doing that work? How do we show people what does it look like to push back against environmental injustice, to recognize climate change and to be climate resilient? How do we photograph and tell those stories? And finally, I think a lot about movement visual journalism, which means to tell stories about those who are advocating and organizing for social, economic, and or environmental justice. So thinking about the power that we have as journalists and storytellers to help elevate and represent and highlight the movements that are taking place. So I think solutions journalism and movement journalism are very imbricated, and I would really just call that journalism. But hopefully we'll get to a point where we do think of all of this as journalism writ large rather than these kind of niche spaces. So now I teach visual journalism and critical and ethical issues in journalism at Temple University. And as Judy mentioned, I work closely with Authority Collective, which is an opportunity to kind of resource and network visual women and non-binary visual storytellers of color. So for me, all of that work stems from and is informed by an approach to an ethics of care. I'm going to kind of walk through my work and my thought, my practices and kind of my thinking as I show images today. And please feel free to drop any questions that you have in the chat. I know I often will forget my question, so if something comes up for you, go ahead and put it in the chat and we'll return to it when we get to the Q&A. So before I talk about some of my long form projects in depth, I want to share a little bit about my relationship to visual storytelling and the work that helped me arrive at those long form stories, sharing some of my favorite assignments and stories. And one of the things one of the reasons why I love visual journalism so much is the opportunity to meet and get to often very briefly know incredible people who are doing important, interesting things that I wouldn't otherwise have the chance to know. Like this woman who is an investigative genealogist. She was responsible for catching serial killers, right, through her work through ancestry.com, and that she kind of taught herself. And I got to spend an afternoon with her and her family at her home in the OC, working, also photographing civil rights activists. And I spent a wonderful day photographing roller dancers in Los Angeles on Venice Beach for ESPN. I've had the opportunity to photograph this Marine medic, which was a really great day. Also, I actually fell off of a ladder and one of his, as I was trying to get the shot, it was really important. And I had this little kind of halfway, not a super tall ladder that I get up on sometimes during photo assignments. And I 100% fell off in front of a bunch of Marines, but it was okay. They respected that I jumped right back up, which is what you got to do. I learned that from dancing, from dancing in dance concerts, and sometimes you do fall down on stage. So pick yourself right back up. And this assignment was actually really interesting because we couldn't show this person's face. He works as a kind of a medic in high risk situations. So he'll kind of get dropped into places to save US military service people's lives and then evacuate them. And so they want to keep his identity and other aspects anonymous. And so thinking about that as we were photographing this, or as I was photographing this and working with them, how do we show the work that you do, but also really make sure that we're not harming you and your ability to do your job just to tell the story? And I really love this photo, but I'm thinking now I should have shown you all the photo where I hid his face with a blood bag that he was holding up. And actually, as he was, which I was really proud of, that was one of the latter shots. And actually, as we were doing this, he was working with a younger Marine who fainted because we kept having to take more blood from him. He was fine, everything was fine. But also thinking about moments like that, we stopped and got water and we're checking in. You don't want to ever do anything that is putting other people in dangerous positions just because it's a good photo opportunity, right? So um, always thinking about that impact as you're taking and making images. Trayvell Anderson is a wonderful journalist I had the opportunity to spend some time with as well. And during 2020, I think that time period was a really important kind of awakening for many folks in visual journalism about what it means to work in this practice of an ethics of care. Even if we weren't necessarily using that language at the time, proceeding with caution and really thoughtfully engaging with the folks that were documenting and photographing to think, how might me showing up make you ill, right? How might you make me ill? How are we going to work in this space together so that we can both remain safe, be as low risk as possible? So what does that look like in terms of sharing physical space together, which is the requirement of visual journalism, while we're in a global pandemic and have to really be very thoughtful and conscientious about breathing near each other, about touching things, right? And so for me, this was a time to keep doing this work because I love visual journalism. And so I wanted to continue to tell these stories. I wanted to be very present in the world and in the spaces where, everything is happening and people need to know what's going on, even though this pandemic is affecting all of us. And we're, in that moment, everyone in the world was part of this news story, right? We're all being impacted by it in different ways, but globally impacted. And so this is an incredible opportunity for us to work through this together, to think about how we show up for each other while we also do our job, while we also tell these stories. So I pause on this image to think about that, because I had the opportunity to photograph downtown Crenshaw Rising, actually from the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, a couple weeks apart, ironically, where the story is about this group of folks living in Crenshaw who wanted to keep the Crenshaw Mall in the hands of Black residents for this historically Black neighborhood. And they were fighting very hard for it to not be gentrified or sold off to non-Black owners. And so they're gathering and they're being very thoughtful about, they have elder folks working in the elder community members who are working as part of this, wanting to be very conscientious about their health. There's children that not pictured here that would often come. And so always thinking again about doing that work together and checking in with people consistently. You can't see this, of course, but I'm wearing a mask while I was doing this work. And I would often ask people, is my proximity or distance to you okay right now? How do you feel about that? I want to get closer in sometimes to take certain photos, but only if that is something that you're comfortable with. And so having those conversations and trying to keep that boundary in mind. Sometimes something exciting is happening and you want to get close, and then you just have to remind yourself, well, that person asked you to stay 10 feet away. So let's back up a little bit and keep that in mind. And other things like this image here on the right is of Melina Abdullah, who is one of the co-founders of BLM LA. And she invited me into her home to photograph her. But I also know that her home had been targeted by different kind of anti-BLM folks, and they would do things like send the SWAT team to her house. So when I was photographing, when I'm taking these images, I was trying to strip metadata from the photos. I don't want anyone to use my photos to be able to find, her home address or anything like that. And I'm very careful thinking as we're taking photos, and we decided not to take photos in the front yard. We're taking photos in her home in areas that are not super visible, that people hopefully will not be able to look at these photos and say, oh, I recognize that, whatever it is, and I know where she lives. So sometimes it's little things like that that make a big difference. And then also communicating that to the person that you're working with. Like when I had the opportunity to meet Melina, I thanked her for being in her space, and I asked her, I know that you have been targeted. What can I do as we're taking these portraits, making these portraits together. Is there anything you want me to be considerate of, cognizant of, and just keeping that conversation open. So if there is ever a point where she said, you know, I don't really want this in the background, or I don't want to include this, then of course saying, of course, yes, you know, there's always another place you can take an image. There's always another way you can make a photograph work that doesn't have to put someone in an uncomfortable or compromising position. And then I learned a lot about, or started thinking a lot about how we can, as visual journalists, shift our practices in important ways as we were photographing the racial justice protests of 2020. I was working alongside a lot of photographers. So many people were documenting this across the country. We saw so many incredible, important images. And I feel really privileged to have had the opportunity to be a photographer and to be a visual storyteller in that time period. And I hope that, you know, so many of the images that were made during that year will continue to impact and affect people, and continue to inform and impact change, or affect change rather, for years to come. But I do feel that I ended up photographing a lot of different things, I would say, than what some people photographed, because I wanted to focus on what I was seeing in the stories I was experiencing, which was about community care. What I saw more than anything was the way that people were taking care of each other, the way that people were being very conscientious about COVID and people's health, about people needing to be fed, to receive water, to receive hand sanitizer. People are passing out gloves and masks and food for free. I have this photo of someone who has like a free peanut butter and jelly sandwiches sign, and they're standing up in a car so that people can see it. You know, there was so much that showed me how much community care matters, and how little we see that in our news media. You know, the front page of the New York Times doesn't typically, the photo that makes the front page isn't of someone handing out PB&J sandwiches, right? It's something on fire, it's tear gas, it's conflict and violence. And those things are important too. Those are happening. Those are stories that we have to tell, that we should tell, that people should know about. And people need to know about all these other things that are happening. When I go to a protest with 100,000 people and I don't see a single fire, and I don't see a single conflict or violent moment, of course, I'm not everywhere at all times, but that's my experience, what I'm seeing. And so that's part of the story that is there, and I need to tell that story as well. So I spent a lot of time doing that during 2020, and trying to emphasize what community and caregiving at the site of protests can look like. Oh, I thought I had some photos in here of Sea Shepherd. I was going to talk a little bit about one of my favorite photo assignments that I ever did, which was spending 2 days on a ship, the Sea Shepherd ship, with eco pirates, which I love the ocean and I love the idea of eco pirates. And so that was a really great opportunity to work with different folks and to kind of document different elements of environmental justice, right? Thinking about how Mexican fishermen are being impacted by the kind of presence of Sea Shepherd, as the Sea Shepherd folks try to fight back against the use of illegal fishing nets. And so thinking about the intersection of the natural environment, protecting the vaquitas dolphins and the totoaba fish off the coast of San Felipe, but also how is this an issue of what it means to be a working class Mexican person, what it means to be, you know, in the situation where you are using illegal fishing nets because that's what you have access to. And so trying to tell a story that is a little more complex, and recognizing the different angles of the story. It's not always what it seems like. You know, my assignment was to photograph the vaquitas dolphins if I could. The vaquitas dolphins never showed up. At the time there was only like 20 of them left in that whole area, so it's unsurprising we didn't see them. But I saw many other things that didn't quite fit into the science desk for the New York Times story. And so I took that with me as a different story that I might want to tell in future. I haven't had any bites yet from, you know, if anyone knows of someone I should pitch this important Sea Shepherd story to, about, you know, from the coast of Mexico to the Chinese markets for the totoaba gallbladder, where they believe it has healing properties. I would love to continue telling that story. But essentially, this kind of walk through different images of mine is to think about the process and thinking that got me to telling these stories. House of Light and Immersed in Oil, which I'll go into now. And House of Light really predates, it started in 2018. And it was one of the first long form stories that I ever had the opportunity to tell that was really about social justice and the kind of political ramifications of immigration, things that I had cared about for a long time as a first generation American coming from a family of immigrants, but I didn't have a story that I connected with until this one. And the way that I got to this story, in December of 2018, I have a few friends. I mentioned that I was once a dancer, and so I often photograph dancers, and I was connected to Contra Tiempo, which is this LA-based dance company that kind of works at the intersection of social justice, activism, advocacy, and community advocacy and dance. And they were going to Tijuana to bring, to donate food and clothing and money and all of these different things that many people were bringing at the time to give to asylum seekers and to the migrants who had arrived at the border on what was at the time the largest migrant caravan. But they also wanted to do something a little different, which was lead migrants and asylees in dance. So they were bringing folks who were well-versed in salsa, bachata, cumbia, acro yoga. And you can see here, we're outside of, at the time, a different shelter, a much smaller shelter that catered to the community by giving out food every day at lunch. They would offer free food to folks who were unhoused in the area or to the many different migrants who were in Tijuana at the time awaiting their asylum cases. And I show these images because at a certain point, one of the folks who worked at the shelter came up to me and asked me if I would stop taking images. She told me that, and she was very kind about it. She was, she thanked me for taking photos and for wanting to document this story. And she told me that this shelter was primarily for LGBTQ plus folks, and that in their previous location, when people found out where they were, they had set fire to the shelter. And so they were in a particularly vulnerable position. And she was worried about me taking images that would then end up in, potentially newspapers, plastered on home pages and front pages. And that's a legitimate fear, right? That if I'm going to say, here's the shelter, you can see where it is, and give all this information, and the people in that shelter would then be in danger. When she explained this to me, I stopped photographing. I also, at the time, was with, let's see if, at the time I was with a few other photographers and a film crew that had joined us to do this episode of a Netflix dance show where this woman goes around the world and dances in different places, which was kind of problematic for its own reasons. But one of the producers on that show asked me why I wasn't taking photos, and I told him, I had this conversation, so I decided not to photograph anymore. And he said, no, you don't need to listen to that. Photograph whatever you want, whenever you want. Never listen to anyone who's telling you not to take photos. And that has really stuck with me because I know that's the idea and the relationship that many people unfortunately have to documentation, whether it's documentary film or documentary photography, photojournalism. And that is not my relationship to photography. I care about what happens to the people that I'm working with. I care about my images causing, affecting change in a positive way and not causing harm. And so that was really just this moment for me where I could see this stark difference in the power structures and how people can use the power that they have and the welcome that we've received to document this thing that's happening. And the thing is that Contra Tiempo and those folks who are part of that company, they had given us their permission to accompany them and to photograph them. But that doesn't extend to everyone around them. That doesn't extend to everyone who decides to start dancing with them and who are having, this beautiful experience, that doesn't mean that they have given their consent to be part of our images. And they shouldn't have to choose between having this moment of joy where they get to dance and, live their lives, but maybe they don't want to be photographed. And so, they don't want to automatically give up their right to not be photographed. And of course, we are in a public space. So in many ways, we can argue that we have the right to photograph, but an ethic of care asks us to think about not just our rights, but our responsibilities. What do we owe the people that we're working with? And how can we show up in different ways? Again, there's always something else to photograph. If someone says no thank you to a photo, it's very easy to move on and photograph something else. There's a million different things happening at any given time. And my desire to take a picture does not supersede someone's desire, to be safe. So those are some of the things that I was thinking about that became really prevalent in my work and many people's works during the protests of 2020, but also as I was doing this this particular project, which preceded the protests. And another thing was that as I was thinking about going to photograph the migrant caravans, the folks who were coming through with the migrant caravans and the migrants at the border, I was hearing from friends of mine who I have a very big network of activists and community advocates, many of whom work on the border and had been doing so for a long time. And they're working with asylees, and they're telling me that a lot of the images and news stories that were being published in the kind of mainstream news media at the time that showed people crossing the border, illegally and had people's names and information, that some of that was being used in asylum cases against the asylum seekers. So that was a big concern of mine, that I don't want to, I wasn't, when I'm taking these images, I wasn't photographing for a particular person. I was photographing for contratiempo and for, my own desire to see kind of what is happening and tell the story. So I wanted to be really cognizant of how do I not replicate any kind of harm like that, and while still doing my job as a visual journalist, still getting the story and talking to people and making sure I understand what is happening to them and representing that accurately. So I also had the opportunity we went to a few different places during this trip to Tijuana in December 2018. And this is the El Baratel shelter, where folks were really excited to try acro yoga and to dance with the folks at Contratiempo. And as I spoke to people there, I asked them what had been their experience with mainstream media, what had been their experience with folks who were coming to donate different things and try and provide some kind of support and resources. And the thing that they said that really stuck with me is how important it was to them to be seen as humans, to be treated with respect, and this decision that Contratiempo made to show up and dance with people was such a different experience than many of these folks had from their own telling. And they said, no one has come here and just danced with us. No one has come here and just sat with us. And so I started thinking about, what does it look like to document and tell the story of migrants' joy instead of just the kind of, difficulties they're experiencing, which is, of course, an important story that we need to see also. And I got connected to a space called Casa de Luz, which was a shelter run by and for migrants. And this person, Irving Mondragon, he was actually he's a Mexican citizen who identifies as gay, and he was going with migrant caravans, kind of meeting them, and then trying to gather together LGBTQ plus folks in the caravan to come together and kind of have safety in numbers and build a community as they move through as they trekked to the border across Central America. And then when they reached Tijuana, they had this shelter to live in together. And I started telling this story I started working on this story through a World Press Photo and Solutions Journalism grant that focused on solutions visual journalism, to look at how the residents of Casa de Luz supported each other, built community, and managed to make a home and a space together, a space of caring and support that help them find resources like lawyers who would support their asylum cases, take care of their children while they went to work, to recognize the many trans women and trans men and other queer folks who were living in this community, to kind of recognize them as they wanted and needed to be recognized. And so many of these people were running from homophobia and transphobia and the real fear of death and murder at the hands of their own family and friends and community members in the places they're coming from, Honduras, El Salvador. So to find home and community and love and support and acceptance and validation of their identity in Casa de Luz, I think was really powerful. And that was the story that I was trying to tell, is how they built a home together. So this is my House of Light project. And I worked on this for about 2 years. And a couple other things, I went through those really quickly. So that continued for me, this sense of trying to showcase connection and humanity behind the kind of typical images we often see of impoverished or devastated migrants. I wanted to kind of change that visual narrative and show how people are combating these issues of human rights and creating a support network within themselves. I think this is the power and potential benefit of photography for me, to tell a holistic story where we humanize people and build possible connections between the viewer and the viewed. So thinking about thriving in the face of adversity, asset-first visual storytelling, like what strengths are people putting into practice to change the world for themselves, and sharing the work with people who invited me to tell their stories. This was another important thing. Anytime I would go to Tijuana, anytime I would spend there, afterwards, I would send the images to them. And what really struck me was that they often used those photos as family pictures, right, to show their children growing up, to send to their family that remained in, in their home nations, to show as kind of like proof of life, like I exist, I'm doing well, I'm surviving, and also to validate their identity as trans women, which was often, again, invalidated. There was, there were several folks that when I would come with my camera, they would get very excited and get very dressed up and, put on all their makeup and put on their favorite clothes. And we were kind of just doing a portrait, photo shoot. And when I first started, started out thinking I'm going to tell the story about Casa de Luz, I had all these ideas about what I wanted to, how I wanted this to look, or what kind of story I wanted to tell. And as time went on, I just wanted to take portraits of these folks. I just wanted to photograph them in a way that they could look back on and remember this time and feel good about it. I just wanted to give them the thing that reflected to them the reality of their own lives. And in doing that, I feel like I told a different and possibly more important story than I had ever told before, because it wasn't about this imagined audience. It was about doing the work of photography for the community that had let me into their space. And a couple other notes on a practice that centers an ethic of care. I speak terrible Spanish. I speak Spanish at the level of a toddler. So for me, it was really important that I was getting consent from folks in their first language, in the language they feel most comfortable in. So I hired a translator with the funding support of World Press Photo, and made sure that I also had the translator take each person who I was photographing and separately, individually confirm with them that they understood who I was, what I was doing there, where these images were going, and that they could give their consent, not just consent given to me through Irving, because Irving was my main contact, and he, I think he's a good guy. He's running this shelter, but regardless of how great someone might seem, I don't know what's happening, and the kind of backstage in terms of consent. So I want to make sure that anyone knew that they could say no, thank you, that they weren't required to be a part of this, this visual story or this project just because they're living at the shelter and the shelter director said yes to me. So trying to get that, that consistent consent, and that also they could say no thank you at a future time. They could say yes please now and no thank you later, and that would all be totally fine. So that was a really important component of this for me. And I will say I was really nervous when that story finally published. I was so scared. Just, I think oftentimes you have this feeling like, how is it going to be taken, and how are people going to feel about it? And I got some of the most incredible outpouring of appreciation from many people, not only from the folks at Casa de Luz, but I had colleagues and strangers email me to say thank you for photographing immigrants and Central American immigrants and telling a visual story in a way that they were like, I've never seen that before. I know many other people are doing that. I cannot take, I'm not corner the market on telling important and thoughtful stories about immigrants, but it was important to be in the New York Times, and it was important, I think, for folks to see that who felt like they hadn't been seen in that way. And so I can tell that having an ethic, that kind of approach of care-oriented ethics impacts people and is meaningful. Okay, and finally, I'll talk about my Immersed in Oil project. I feel like I may be taking up too much time. Do we have we're gonna do a Q&A, right, Judy?
We are.
Okay, so I'll take like 5 minutes on this. Is that good?
Yeah, but don't like go.
Okay. Yeah, slow me down if I'm talking too
It's
fast.
great.
Okay, thank you, Judy. And just a reminder, if folks have questions or thoughts or anything, please do drop it in the chat. I can't see it right now, but I will see it momentarily. So I finished up working on the Casa de Luz story, and I think it published in September 2021. And I was kind of working on these two things at the same time. I was new to LA when I had only been in LA for about 18 months, I think, when COVID happened, or when the lockdown started. And right before the lockdown, I had heard this great talk by a colleague of mine when I was a professor at LMU, who was his work was on greenwashing. And from him, I learned about the history of oil in Los Angeles. And I was, horrified and confused. I was just kind of like, what? LA was built on oil, not Hollywood. What are you telling me? But then it started to make sense, all of the different oil derricks I see around the Inglewood oil field. And so I really wanted to know more about this and tell the story. And then I had the opportunity to work with Earth Justice on the 6-month story, where I was going to Kern County, where Manuel Martinez, you see in this photo, this is taken in his home in Lamont, I believe, in Kern County. And I'm working with folks in Wilmington, in Long Beach, Signal Hill, Inglewood, and learning as I photograph and talk to people about this environmental justice issue that is impacting millions of Angelinos and other Southern Californians, often without them knowing about it. So nearly 4 million Los Angeles residents live on 28 oil fields containing 3,000 active wells, and many of them are unaware of the kind of noxious impact, the effects that it has on our communities. But it's been primarily Black and brown neighborhoods like Inglewood and Wilmington and rural Kern County that have long borne the brunt of oil infrastructure's health and environmental impacts. So this project was about trying to tell the story, not just of the impact on those communities, but also who is working to change, to push back against big oil's kind of incursion into our homes, our parks, our schools, our grocery stores, our restaurants. I mean, this is an image from Signal Hill Park, which is a suburb of Long Beach. And it's really shocking just how prevalent and how proximal, like how close these oil wells are to homes and playgrounds and schools. Like just they're literally sitting in the middle of the places where people live and eat and work and play and learn. And so I also wanted to take portraits of the people who've been doing this work to push back, of the community justice advocates like Nayeli Kobo here. She first became ill as a 10-year-old living across from this Alanco energy site that you see in the photo here. And I photographed her a couple of years apart, actually. This is an image from 2020 when she was struggling with a really lethal and very unusual, like rare cancer at 19 that she survived. She had actually just come from chemo in this photo. And she did survive that cancer, but it unfortunately took all of her reproductive organs. So at 19, she lost the ability to ever have a child in that way. And she continues to tell the story of how living next to oil has impacted her. And this photo is of, she's holding this photo of her as a 10-year-old, where she used to be so ill and hospitalized all the time. She had nosebleeds that would make her have to sleep sitting up at night so that she wouldn't asphyxiate on her own blood. And it's stories like that that I heard as I photographed this story that told me how important it was to really focus on the people and what they were experiencing, and not just kind of landscapes like this. Although I did take also many landscapes to try and show that proximity of the oil wells. And stories like Diana and Jose Morales here, who lived in Lamont their whole lives, raised their whole family there. And Jose now has to have daily dialysis, and they're really worried about how his health will be impacted by the toxic water, the toxic air, and all of these things that are happening due to the kind of oil. Oh, and this photo here, this is the sky above Wilmington, or above in Kern County pretty much all the time. It's just, you can see the layers of toxic air quality just every single day that I'm there. And as I told these stories as well, of going into Wilmington, I would be photographing there and have a miserable headache every single time by the end of the day. I have asthma, and just my asthma would be activated. So I was physically experiencing firsthand, what people experience living there all the time. And if this is what happens to me after 1 day, 2 days in these spaces, I can't imagine what it is to live there for 40 years of your life, right? And I think honoring that, and then that's something that I would share with the folks I was talking to. So validating their experiences and acknowledging that I'm experiencing this too. I'm not just some outsider who's come here. I'm trying to learn, and I'm willing to sit with these impacts so that I can spend time with you and try and understand what it is to, in some small way. Of course, I'm not living their life, and I do have the privilege to leave and to not live in Kern County or Wilmington, but trying to sit with them and know what this means that they have to be there all the time. So this story, I think there were some limitations that I experienced, and I'm trying to kind of wrap the story up. Now, I'm actually returning to Kern County to photograph more of farm workers there and try and show what it is to work in that space daily, in those fields where, they're kind of going to be affected by all the pesticides. The water in Kern County is super toxic. All of these different things, but trying to show more of the human element and less of just those kind of landscapes of showing workers in the field. Those are the kinds of things I'm thinking about trying to expand on this long form story and make it more impactful. And yeah, I think I'll just have a few other things to say about it, but mostly I think I want to get to the Q&A. And this also, I wanted to say that this work was funded and supported by the Pulitzer Center and Diversify Photo through their Eyewitness Photojournalism Grant. They really appreciated the opportunity to tell these stories, and also really appreciate that people are excited about solutions journalism stories. And I think solutions journalism is kind of a bit of a misnomer. We're not always showing solutions, right? Like being a community activist isn't a solution to toxic oil, but it is a method, right? It's a method for impact and affecting change, and trying to show that people can do this and are doing this for themselves, I think is really powerful. And it's powerful because it's empowering for those who see it and learn about it. And actually this evening, I have a exhibition premiering here in LA for opening that is a collaborative effort to focus on environmental justice in Los Angeles. It's called Next Door. So this is like my third or fourth exhibit around these environmental justice stories. And every time folks come, they say, I didn't know about this. And wow, this is so important to see. And so I get, a lot of positive feedback showing that we do need to tell these stories, and that we need to tell it in a way that highlights and centers the experience of folks who are living it, and that they're doing this work. Okay, thank you so much for listening to me.
Wow. And that's like 1/10 of what she's doing. So to be super honest with, right, Martin? You're like, yeah, wow, incredible. Cool. So we've got a question from Victoria, which is a great one, right? About you, about your ethic of care, about yourself. Dr. Pixley, how do you protect yourself and recharge your own energy and well-being after being around such heaviness, right?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Through the
Thank you.
amazing work you do.
Thank you. I'm still processing how to do that, but I spend a lot of time with family and friends. I love to dance. I love music festivals. And one of the things that is really, what's the word, like reinvigorating or rejuvenating about about live music and going to kind of like dance with folks is just that sense of being in inherent community, of like having this shared joy. And that reminds me that there's something worth fighting for, right? That despite all of the really terrible things that we do to each other and all of the really difficult things that we have to live through and to push back against and these hard stories to tell, that humans are worth it, and that there's a reason that we're doing this work and that we do it by being in community. So that's how I kind of recharge. And also I just love to read. So I'll sit down and read a good fantasy novel and transport myself to some totally different world where they have their own issues, but it's not these.
That's good. That's great advice. And I just thought about that word that you said, community. We're doing these little meetings with our president here, and we're trying to talk about our values, because Foothill College lists words that are our values, or they have been doing that. And that was a word that came up a number of times. So I'm really thinking about community, right? And yeah, so thanks for bringing that up. Let's see. Eric Schmidt has a question in the chat that asks, are you retouching or toning your images at all? Do you use Lightroom or Photoshop? How much retouching or toning do you do, if you in fact do them?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Mary. As a visual journalist, I do very little limited retouching or toning. The rule of document or of journalism is to retain the reality of the image as you took it to the best of your ability. So I use Lightroom, not Photoshop anymore. I used to use Photoshop pre-Lightroom, but I've been on Lightroom now for, I'd say, 15 years. I don't know how long it's been available. It's much easier than Photoshop. And I primarily do things like exposure, white balance. Sometimes I'll do a little bit of sharpening if the image feels, not quite sharp enough. And yeah, like really minimal kind of shifts to exposure. I never do, no taking anything out of or putting anything into an image. Yeah, that's, I think the most retouching I would ever do for images in my visual journalism practice is like if there's a water spot that was on my lens or something like that, I might like take that out. But even that I would tend to avoid. Just I don't want to give any sense of impropriety. So a very, very minimal retouching.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that answer. And I hope that people who are not in the visual journalism world, like, get that. Like, we're super constrained in a good way on ethics around retouching. And as Dr. Pixley brought up, she's also like thinking about AI, right? And how we're going to move forward in that world as visual journalists, right? So thank you, Dr. Pixley. Chloe Troffatter asked, do you ever find yourself at odds with editors in a push to use photos that represent community care, especially in protest stories and things like that? How do you approach these conversations? Great answer.
Great question, Chloe. Thank you. So, I think I've been really, I don't know whether I want to say lucky because it's sort of intentional, but I have the privilege of only taking on works that I want to do because I work as a professor. That is my full-time job. And so all of my freelance work is accepting assignments, commissions, doing long form projects that I'm excited about.
There you go.
If an editor ever tried to, if they were like, I want to hire you to photograph this protest and I really want you to emphasize, like the violence or what, I've never had anyone say something like that. But if they did, I would say I'm not going to do that. Like that isn't the kind of work that I do. And frankly, they wouldn't hire me to do that. They would look at my work and say, this is not what she does, if they're a good editor and they're paying attention. So I often get assigned work that aligns with the kind of work that I already do, because that's what people recognize is my expertise. So in that way, I think I, have the benefit of not having to do that. But I will say this, I don't ever submit an image that I don't want to see in print. So I'll take all kinds of photos of whatever is happening, because you never know. It's rare that I won't not take a photo unless someone asks me explicitly not to, and I think that request is valid. Like if a cop was like, "Don't take this photo of me beating someone," I would take that photo, of course. But if a protester said, "Please don't take this photo of me, I don't want to be on camera," I would just take a photo of another protester. But if I took images, that when I'm sitting down and looking at them, for me, is not an accurate representation of what was happening, or I think is like telling a story that's different than my experience or the one I want to be responsible for telling, I just won't submit those images to the editor. So I think that's really important. You don't have any say over your photos once they're out of your hands, and they're not going to come back and ask me, what do you think about these images or this layout? So you only want to turn in work that you stand behind. And in that way, I get to avoid, submitting or having images published that I want to have a fight about. Hopefully that answers the question.
It does. I need to add a caveat though, because you're a freelance photographer, right? So you own your
Yeah.
images. When you're working for an institution or an organization, if you share copyright, or if you're working for work for hire, the people who you're working with own the images. And so you don't normally have a luxury of you have the ability to say, these are the images that I stand behind and this is why, with the editor, but it's just a different, yeah.
Yeah. And actually, thank you for the reminder about that, because I do know that some outlets like Nat Geo, I think is a place that does that, requires you to turn in your entire card. And they want to see that every image you've taken is, in sequential order. So if I haven't had that experience ever, but I know colleagues who have. If I was in that situation, then I would be really, really conscientious about what images I photographed. Other questions? I don't see the questions in the chat, so I don't know if
They were just sent to me, and
Oh,
then
okay,
they were in
okay,
the
got it.
Q&A, and you already answered them.
Okay.
I've got a quick question. This is probably a bad question to ask you, right? Because we have a book to finish. But what other projects, do you have a photography project that you're working on now, other than the continuation of the oil? Is there anything else you're
Yeah.
kind of looking at, or are you mainly working in that kind of head academic space and realm that Martin and I can commiserate, and Ron maybe with you?
Yeah, I'm hoping to, wrap up the last few images of the Immersed in Oil project as I leave LA in the next couple months. But my next project that I will not start on until the book is done, this book and my next book, but I'm starting to kind of put feelers out and apply for grants for it and things like that, is looking at climate resilience actions in Jamaica, and how I'm Jamaican-American, so I have a lot of family in Jamaica and a lot of history there, and I want to look at how the island is being impacted by climate change and what people are doing about it, because there's a lot of great work being done to mangrove replanting to help with soil and sand erosion, and water recapture in the mountains for farming, and like fisheries that are repopulating fish populations. And so I'm hoping that someone will fund my project to work with Jamaican scientists and filmmakers and other photographers and journalists there to do this really expansive project looking at climate resilience in Jamaica.
That's so awesome and interesting. Gosh. Well, thank you so much for your time. It was just a fabulous talk. I love, and Chloe, great to see you too. I'm glad that you all are connecting. Chloe was one of the student photojournalists that I wrote about extensively at MSU.
Oh, yeah,
Who did a
awesome.
pretty amazing job navigating that tragedy and resiliency too in the same breath. So And I also want to just thank Dean Ron Herman for being here, my colleague Lisa Stone. Oops, gosh, hold on, I'm declining that. And again, just thanks so much, Tara. Oh, hey, Lisa.
Hi.
Um,
Thank you all so much. And I just wanted to quickly say, I just sent Judy, it looks like I can only send you direct messages. So I just sent my email if folks want to reach out or continue the conversation. If you have other questions or if I can help you with anything, please do reach out to me. I love to hear from folks. And, as I mentioned, I'm all about community. So let's build community together and stay networked and connected and in touch.